when some wag said it's feasible to think responsibly about one thing and not the other. Well, I could see from that one sentence that that was perfectly ridiculous. And it pushed me further into my natural drift, which was into learning all the big ideas and all the big disciplines.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on, well, quite an ambitious journey. We're looking at some of the most monumental shifts in human history.
That's right.
Our mission isn't just about dates or, facts. It's about unearthing the big ideas, the concepts that fundamentally rewired how humanity lives, governs, and even understands the world.
Mm-hmm.
We really want to explore how these foundational shifts shaped who you are today.
Precisely. And these aren't isolated historical footnotes, are they? They're interconnected threads. Each one kind of pulls the next along.
Okay.
And it reveals this profound story of human progress, and maybe some surprising consequences, too. We'll trace these connections, hopefully, directly to your modern world.
So get ready for a deep dive that we hope brings some genuine insights, maybe some unexpected links, and just a clearer understanding of the forces that truly shaped our present.
Let's do it.
Let's begin our chronological journey through humanity's big ideas. Okay, let's kick things off with a shift so fundamental, it completely rewired human existence.
Right.
The Neolithic Revolution.
Yeah.
I mean, for millennia, our ancestors were constantly on the move, hunting, gathering, but then something truly monumental happened.
Yeah, around 10,000 BCE, primarily in the Fertile Crescent, that area in the Middle East, early humans started to transition.
From nomadic life.
Exactly, from that nomadic hunting and gathering lifestyle to settled farming. This meant domesticating plants and animals, establishing permanent villages.
Wow.
You could think about early sites like Jericho in the Levant. That dates back to around 9,000 BCE.
So, okay, let's unpack this. They suddenly had a reliable food source, this food surplus. What was the real game changer there? What did that actually allow?
The food surpluses from agriculture were absolutely transformative. I mean, really key.
How so?
They supported larger, denser populations, and that, in turn, allowed for specialized labor.
So not everyone had to farm anymore.
Exactly. No longer was everyone just focused on finding the next meal. This specialization, this division of labor, was the essential bedrock for the rise of complex societies and eventually the very first cities. It was, as one historian put it, ultimately necessary to the rise of modern civilization.
That's a big claim.
It is. And if you look at maps showing how agriculture spread across Neolithic Europe, starting around 8500 BCE in the Levant, moving west to Iberia by 5200 BCE, northern Europe by 4500 BCE, you're literally seeing a map of this fundamental societal restructuring.
So this wasn't just about, new farming techniques.
Not at all.
It was laying the groundwork for everything that followed: property, maybe conflict over resources, even new diseases as people lived closer together.
All of that. It changed the fundamental relationship between humans and their environment, and between humans themselves.
Okay, so once humans settled down, secured their food, populations grew, labor specialized, this must have created a new kind of problem, right? How do you manage it all?
Exactly. How do you keep track of everything? The green stores, the people, the rules.
Yeah.
And it's out of that urgent need for order, for record keeping, that humanity made its next monumental leap: the invention of writing.
Writing.
Around 3000 BCE, you see the first complex civilizations emerging in these fertile river valleys: Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates,
Right.
ancient Egypt along the Nile. These societies developed cities, monumental architecture, clear social hierarchy,
And writing systems.
and crucially sophisticated writing systems.
So the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, they were really pioneers here with cuneiform.
They were definitely at the forefront. Cuneiform script pops up around 3400 BCE. Their city of Uruk produced the world's first known texts.
What was the actual power of writing things down back then?
Well, the ability to write enabled the administration of these increasingly complex societies. Suddenly, you could manage resources efficiently, record transactions accurately, preserve knowledge.
Beyond just memory.
Exactly. In a way that oral tradition simply couldn't handle at that scale. Think about early legal codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon around 1750 BCE.
Right, the stone stele.
Yeah, inscribed on stone, put out in public. It detailed laws and justice, making rules visible, permanent, less arbitrary. And you see similar independent developments happening elsewhere, too, like the Indus Valley in ancient China.
It's just incredible to think about that shift. trying to run a complex society without written rules or records, it seems almost impossible from our perspective.
It highlights how fundamental writing was to building larger, more organized states.
Okay, from rules etched in stone, we jump forward to a really radical idea. Rules by the people themselves. That's the powerful legacy of the ancient Greeks and Romans, right, shaping our political thought.
Absolutely. You look at Athens during the 5th century BCE, and you see this emergence of direct democracy.
Direct democracy.
Yeah. Free male citizens could directly vote on laws, on policy decisions in the assembly. Think of statesmen like Pericles championing this.
Of course, it had its major limits, as you said, free male citizens, women, slaves, foreigners.
Oh, absolutely excluded. It was far from universal by our standards, but the idea of citizen participation was revolutionary for its time.
So Athens gives us that direct citizen involvement, but the Romans, they added something crucial to the blueprint too, didn't they? What was their unique contribution?
The Roman Republic, which ran from about 509 to 27 BCE, they really pioneered a representative form of government.
Okay.
So elected officials like consuls and a very powerful Senate, their political structure emphasized concepts like the separation of powers, the rule of law. You see this in things like the 12 Tables Law Code.
Although, again, maybe the reality was different. Power often stayed with the elites.
Oh, for sure. In practice, real power often remained concentrated among the elite patrician families, but the structure and the ideals were incredibly influential.
So why are these ancient experiments still so vital? Why do we keep talking about Athens and Rome when discussing modern politics?
Because they provided what's often called a lasting blueprint. Later societies, including, many modern democracies, looked back and drew profound inspiration from Athenian democracy's idea of citizen participation and from the Roman Republic's concepts of a Senate, representation, checks on executive power. Thinkers like Aristotle, Cicero, they analyzed these systems, debated them, gave us a vocabulary for political thought that we still use.
It's true. Our own governments, the debates we have about power and representation, so much of it still draws directly from these ancient experiments. It's a powerful thread.
It really is.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's explore a different kind of foundation. Not political structures, but shared belief systems.
Right, the world of ideas and faith.
This period, roughly 800 BCE to 600 CE, is what the philosopher Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age.
The Axial Age, yes. A fascinating concept.
He argued it was a time when these really profound, universalizing ethical and philosophical systems emerged across different cultures, almost simultaneously. A shift away from purely local myth towards more abstract, reflective thinking.
Exactly. During this transformative period, you see these profound religious and philosophical ideas popping up across the old world. In South Asia, you get the foundational texts of Hinduism, like the Vedas and Upanishads, developing over centuries.
Buddhism.
And then Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama in the 5th century BCE, teaching concepts like enlightenment, karma, escaping the cycle of suffering ideas that spread incredibly far.
And what was happening over in China around the same time?
In China, you had figures like Confucius around the 6th century BCE, developing Confucianism.
Which focused on?
Emphasis on moral order, social harmony, filial piety, very focused on ethical conduct in society. And around the same time, you have Laozi, traditionally credited with founding Taoism, which focused more on harmony with the natural order, the Tao.
Okay, so South Asia, China. Meanwhile, the Middle East was seeing the rise of something utterly revolutionary. Monotheism.
Absolutely revolutionary. The Israelites' worship of one God evolved into Judaism, a faith centered on covenant, law, and history.
And from that soil.
From that soil, Christianity emerged in the 1st century CE, rooted in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. It spread incredibly widely, so much so that by the 4th century, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
And then, in the 7th century CE, the Prophet Muhammad founded Islam in Arabia. It rapidly united the region under a faith-preaching submission to one God, Allah, and with a very strong emphasis on social justice and community.
It's remarkable how these diverse systems all provided not just, ethical frameworks and community identities, but really cohesive worldviews that shaped entire civilizations. What's their lasting power?
Well, several things. These belief systems often legitimated political authority. Think of divine right, or rulers upholding religious law. And missionary religions like Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam spread far, far beyond their homelands, transforming cultures across continents. Their enduring significance is just immense. They shaped art, law, education, societal values for millennia.
And still do.
And still do. Today, billions adhere to these major religions, and they continue to deeply influence cultural norms, personal lives, and, yes, political landscapes across the globe.
Definitely not just historical footnotes. Understanding them is key to understanding so much of the world today. Okay, let's fast forward past the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We land in the medieval world. It's a time we often picture through castles and knights, maybe like Oravava Castle in Slovakia.
Right, a classic image.
This era saw the rise of feudalism. Now, it can seem chaotic from our view, maybe even backward, but it was surprisingly adaptable, wasn't it? It provided a kind of decentralized stability.
It did. After the collapse of central Roman authority in the West, feudalism became the dominant socio-political structure in medieval Europe, roughly from the 9th to the 15th centuries.
And how did it actually work, that hierarchy?
At its core, it was a hierarchy of mutual obligations built around land ownership. Kings, theoretically at the top, granted land called fiefs to higher lords.
Okay.
Those lords, in turn, granted parts of that land to vassals, like lesser nobles or knights. And the key exchange was land for loyalty and, crucially, military service.
Got it. So who was actually working the land that supported this whole pyramid?
Right at the bottom were the peasants or serfs. They worked the land, giving labor or a portion of their produce to their local lord.
In exchange for?
In exchange for protection. Protection from bandits, other lords, invaders. So power was highly decentralized. Local lords governed their territories from castles, like Orava, wielding significant influence, even while owing allegiance up the chain to a monarch.
And the church. Where did it fit in?
The church was a huge player. It was a central institution, owned vast amounts of land itself, and often rivaled kings in both spiritual and temporal authority. It was another layer of power and obligation.
So it sounds like it offered a rough kind of stability in a pretty unstable world. But it clearly didn't last forever. What led to its decline?
No, it didn't last. Over time, several factors weakened feudal arrangements. You had the gradual growth of trade, the rise of towns with their own charters and merchants.
A divisive power.
Exactly. And stronger, more centralized monarchies slowly started consolidating power. Plus, major events like the Black Death in the 14th century drastically reduced the population, creating labor shortages that undermined serfdom. Lords needed workers more than workers needed lords, in some cases.
But its legacy remained.
Oh, absolutely. For centuries, feudalism profoundly shaped medieval life politics, economics through the manorial system, social roles, and you can still see traces of it today in European nobility titles, land laws, even some social structures.
Understanding feudalism really does help us grasp the deep roots of social class and power dynamics that still echo in many societies, doesn't it?
It really does. It structured life for centuries.
Okay. From the medieval world emerges a period known as the Renaissance, literally a rebirth. What exactly was being reborn, and why was it such a dramatic break from the Middle Ages?
The Renaissance was this incredible cultural rebirth that kicked off in Italy in the 14th century and then spread across Europe through the 15th and 16th centuries.
And what was it breaking from?
It marked a distinct shift away from the primary medieval focus on religious scholasticism, theology and commentary on religious texts. Instead, thinkers and artists turned enthusiastically to the humanities.
Meaning?
Literature, art, history, moral philosophy, and they drew immense inspiration from the rediscovered texts and, crucially, the art of classical Greece and Rome.
And this focus on human potential, on life in this world, was called Renaissance humanism.
That's the core idea, yes.
Yep.
Renaissance humanism celebrated human achievement, potential, and agency in the here and now, not just focusing on the afterlife.
And the art from this period, it just explodes, doesn't it? It feels so different.
It absolutely does. You have artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. They mastered realism perspective, portraying the human form with incredible anatomical precision, but also deep emotion.
Like the David or the Mona Lisa.
Exactly. Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man perfectly captures that blend of science and art, the focus on human proportions, the Mona Lisa's psychological depth.
Yeah.
Michelangelo's David, the sheer power and beauty of the human form, or the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It all exemplifies the Renaissance ideal of the Renaissance man, this idea of someone skilled in many fields, capable of great individual achievement.
So it wasn't just artists.
No, scholars too. Figures like Petrarch tirelessly hunted down and collected ancient manuscripts. New translations recovered crucial works by thinkers like Aristotle and Cicero, which fueled this intellectual explosion across universities and cities.
Beyond the stunning art and rediscovery of text, what other critical things were happening that really pushed Europe into a new era?
Well, the period also saw significant advances in science. People like Copernicus were starting to question old models of the universe, laying crucial groundwork for the later scientific revolution.
Oh, okay.
And of course, this overlaps with the age of exploration. Navigators like Columbus, Vasco da Gama, they were embarking on voyages that dramatically connected continents, redrawing the map of the known world.
And one invention stands out as critical for spreading all these ideas.
The printing press. Absolutely crucial. Invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, it exponentially accelerated the spread of these new ideas. Books became cheaper, knowledge became far more accessible than ever before. It was a communications revolution.
So this period really feels like a pivotal transition, doesn't it? Moving out of the Middle Ages towards modernity, completely reshaping art, education, science by looking back to classical antiquity, but also celebrating human potential in a new way.
A profound shift in perspective.
Okay, so the Renaissance celebrated human potential, and you mentioned science starting to stir. That leads us directly into the scientific revolution, a period that didn't just celebrate humanity, but fundamentally challenged our understanding of the universe itself.
Exactly. The scientific revolution, roughly spanning the 1540s to the 1680s, was that pivotal period. This is where modern science as we know it truly started to emerge.
By doing what?
By directly challenging long-held classical and medieval views of nature. European scientists began to understand the universe in radically new ways, and crucially, they based this understanding on systematic observation, rigorous experimentation, and the language of mathematics.
Okay, so give us the headline names and their truly groundbreaking discoveries. How did they dare to question centuries of accepted wisdom?
Well, the big one in astronomy is Nicholas Copernicus. In 1543, he proposed a heliocentric model.
Sun-centered.
Sun-centered, exactly, placing the sun, not the Earth, at the center of the solar system. This directly contradicted the Ptolemaic geocentric view that had dominated for over 1,000 years.
Huge. And Galileo.
Later, Galileo Galilei used the newly invented telescope to make critical observations, moons orbiting Jupiter, the phases of Venus that provided strong empirical evidence for Copernicus's theory, though famously he faced fierce opposition from the church for it.
Right.
And then, the giant who synthesized so much of it was Isaac Newton. By 1687, with his Principia Mathematica, he laid out the laws of motion and universal gravitation, explaining how planets moved and why apples fell. It was a unified system based on mathematics that seemed to explain the heavens and the earth.
Incredible. But you said it wasn't just what they discovered. The how was equally revolutionary, right? The scientific method itself.
That is absolutely the profound insight. The scientific method, this systematic way of gaining knowledge, was articulated by figures like Francis Bacon, emphasizing empirical evidence, and René Descartes, emphasizing systematic doubt and reason.
So observation, experimentation, logic.
Exactly. Reaching conclusions about the natural world based on evidence, not just authority or scripture. You saw breakthroughs across fields anatomy with Vesalius challenging ancient Greek ideas, physics with Newton and Galileo, chemistry.
Yeah.
They systematically overturned ancient authorities like Aristotle.
It really sounds like a fundamental shift in how humans approach knowledge.
It was enormous.
Yeah.
One historian even called it the most important transformation in human history since the Neolithic Revolution.
Wow.
Because it established science as a reliable, repeatable way to obtain verifiable knowledge about the world. This, in turn, fueled technological innovation and profoundly influenced the Enlightenment thinkers who came next, inspiring them to try applying reason to society itself.
So every time you use technology, trust a scientific fact, rely on evidence, you're really experiencing the legacy of this revolution. It taught humanity how to question in a systematic way.
Precisely, a new way of knowing.
Okay, so science starts demystifying the natural world through reason and evidence. It seems almost inevitable then that thinkers would start applying that same kind of rigorous reason to the human world, to society, government, belief.
That's exactly what happened. And that intellectual firestorm is what we call the Enlightenment.
The Age of Reason.
The Age of Reason, yes. Primarily an 18th century intellectual movement centered in Europe, but with global impact. It championed reason, science, and individual rights as the keys to human progress.
And the core belief was?
Enlightenment philosophers believed that systematic, rational thinking could fundamentally reform government, society, even human beliefs. They valued knowledge gained through rationalism and empiricism, building directly on the methods and successes of the scientific revolution.
Okay, so who were the key thinkers driving this? And what were their most radical, truly revolutionary ideas that challenged that old order?
Well, you have figures like John Locke in England. He argued that people are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property.
Natural rights, not granted by a king.
Exactly. And crucially, that governments require the consent of the governed to be legitimate, a truly groundbreaking concept at the time.
And in France?
You had thinkers like Voltaire, a fierce critic of religious intolerance and absolute monarchy. He championed freedom of thought and expression. Montesquieu proposed the separation of powers in government.
Legislative, executive, judicial.
Exactly, dividing those functions to prevent any one part becoming too powerful, a key check against tyranny. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau discussed the idea of the social contract between rulers and the ruled, and the concept of the general will of the people as the basis for law.
So how did these powerful ideas, liberty, equality, reason, consent, actually undermine that old world of divine right kings and rigid social hierarchies? What was their real-world impact?
They fundamentally challenged the legitimacy of the old order. These key ideals promoted by Enlightenment writers, liberty, equality, toleration, constitutional government, separation of church and state, directly attacked the foundations of absolute monarchy and inherited privilege.
And they inspired action.
Oh, absolutely. Enlightenment thought directly inspired political upheavals. Locke's ideas, for instance, heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson and the American Declaration of Independence in 1776.
Right.
And the French philosophies profoundly influenced the French Revolution that began in 1789 with its powerful calls for the rights of man and the citizen. It literally, as historians say, paved the way for the political revolutions of the late 18th and 19th century.
The very concept of human rights, the structure of modern democratic institutions, the idea that government should serve the people, it all flows directly from this era.
It's impossible to understand modern politics, modern values, without grappling with the Enlightenment. It set the terms of debate for centuries to come.
Okay, from these transformative ideas about society, we move to immense physical changes. We're talking factories, steam power, cities exploding in size. This is the Industrial Revolution.
A massive turning point, yes. Beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, the Industrial Revolution fundamentally transformed economies from being primarily agrarian and based on handcrafting to industrial mass production powered by machines. New inventions and, crucially, new energy sources were key. James Watt's improved steam engine in the 1770s provided efficient, reliable power.
Powering what?
Powering mechanized factories, first in textile, spinning, and weaving, then in ironworks, and eventually much more.
And these changes weren't just confined to the factory walls, were they? They reshaped everything around them.
Absolutely. By the early 1800s, you have steam locomotives and railroads starting to revolutionize transportation. Goods and people could suddenly move much faster and further than ever before.
Shrinking the world.
In a very real way. Later in the 19th century, the telegraph enabled nearly instant communication across vast distances. Industrialization rapidly spread from Britain to continental Europe and North America, leading to this unprecedented rise in economic output and productivity.
You mentioned Britain's textile industry.
Yeah, it surged. As spinning and weaving were mechanized, the cost of cloth plummeted, making textiles far more widely available and driving huge profits.
And this era also saw capitalism really mature into the dominant economic system, right?
It did. Entrepreneurs and industrialists accumulated capital money to invest in these new factories and technologies. And free market ideas gained huge prominence, especially through Adam Smith's hugely influential book, The Wealth of Nations, published back in 1776.
Advocating free trade.
Free trade, minimal government interference in the economy, what we call laissez-faire. It provided the theoretical justification for this burgeoning industrial capitalism.
Now, this sounds like incredible progress in terms of production and wealth, but with such rapid change, urbanization, factory work, that there must have been huge social consequences, often negative ones.
Oh, absolutely. The human cost was immense for many. As industrial capitalism grew, it fueled rapid urbanization. Masses of people moved from the countryside to work in these new factories, crowding into cities like Manchester, Liverpool, London.
Creating new social divisions.
Stark new social classes emerged. A wealthy industrial bourgeoisie, the factory owners, the bankers, and a vast urban working class, the proletariat. And while overall wealth increased, this working class often faced incredibly harsh conditions.
Like what?
Long hours, dangerous working environments in factories and mines, widespread child labor, living in overcrowded, unsanitary slum housing. It was brutal for many.
Did this lead to pushback?
Yes, over time, these conditions led to significant social pressures and eventually reforms. You see the rise of labor unions fighting for better wages and conditions, and governments slowly starting to pass factory acts to regulate hours and safety.
So it's a complex legacy.
Hugely complex. The Industrial Revolution is often considered, alongside agriculture, maybe the most significant event since humans adopted agriculture. It ushered in an era of sustained economic growth and technological change, but also created profound social inequalities and new challenges that we're still grappling with today.
It truly shaped the physical world we live in, how we work, the economic systems we navigate every single day. It really is the engine of the modern world.
Fundamentally so.
Okay, so we have industrialization, urbanization, these massive societal shifts. People are living differently, working differently. It makes sense that they started thinking differently about their collective identity, too.
Exactly.
And this leads us to nationalism. What exactly is nationalism, and how did it dramatically redraw the world map, especially in the 19th century?
Nationalism emerged as this incredibly potent ideology worldwide in the 19th century. At its core, it's the idea, the belief, that people who share commonalities, often language, culture, a sense of shared history, should form their own independent, sovereign nation-state.
So it's more than just patriotism, like love for your region.
It's generally seen as more potent and often more political than simple patriotism. While loyalty to one's homeland existed earlier, nationalism as this driving political force really took hold in this era. The French Revolution in 1789 is often pointed to as a key spark, because it mobilized citizens in the name of the French nation, not just loyalty to a king or dynasty. It linked identity to the state in a new way.
So this powerful idea, it seems like it had opposite effects in different places, sometimes unifying, sometimes breaking things apart.
You've hit on a key dynamic. Yes, it worked both ways. During the 1800s, nationalism swept through Europe. In some cases, it unified people who had been divided among many smaller states or kingdoms.
Like Italy and Germany.
The classic examples. Italy was unified by 1861, Germany by 1871. Both were forged by nationalist leaders, think Garibaldi and Cavour in Italy, Bismarck in Germany, who rallied people around a shared Italian or German identity.
But in other places.
In other cases, nationalism fueled movements to break away from large multi-ethnic empires. Greece fought for and won independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s. Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania followed later. Peoples within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like the Czechs or Hungarians, increasingly demanded self-rule. Poland repeatedly strove to restore its sovereignty after being partitioned.
So what was the core idea, the psychological shift, that made people identify so strongly with the nation over, say, their local lord or their religion?
A defining feature was this idea of popular sovereignty, the belief that the state should represent the people.
But who were the people?
Often, nationalists defined the people based on shared ethnicity, language, or culture, rather than just allegiance to a ruling dynasty. And to build this sense of unity, they actively promoted national symbols, flags, anthems, national holidays, heroic historical narratives. It was a conscious process of creating a shared identity.
So its significance is huge.
Immense. It gave rise to the modern international system, where the nation-state is seen as the default, legitimate political unit. It reshaped the map of Europe and eventually the world.
But it had a dark side, too.
Definitely. While it could be a liberating force, especially in anti-colonial struggles later on, it could also be deeply divisive and aggressive. Rival nationalisms, competing claims, fueled tensions that contributed directly to the outbreak of World War I. The idea that each nation deserved its own state and that national loyalty trumped other loyalties had profound and often bloody consequences.
Right, and as some nations were unifying or breaking free based on this idea of national identity, other already powerful nations were aggressively expanding their control across the globe.
Yes, the 19th century was also the high tide of modern imperialism and colonialism.
Driven by those industrial powers.
Largely, yes. Industrialized nations in Europe, and later the US and Japan, dramatically expanded their empires, exerting political and economic control over vast areas of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific.
You hear about the scramble for Africa. What was that exactly?
It was this period, roughly from 1880 to 1914, of intense competition among European powers. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy to claim territory in Africa. They hastily partitioned almost the entire continent among themselves, often with little regard for existing political or ethnic boundaries.
How much of Africa was colonized?
Astonishingly, by 1913, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained formally independent. The rest was under European rule.
What was driving this massive global land grab? It wasn't just about planting flags, was it?
No, the motivations were complex and often overlapped. There was intense economic competition seeking raw materials for factories back home, new markets for manufactured goods.
Right, fueling the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. There was also strategic rivalry between the powers controlling key trade routes or naval bases, and underpinning it all were powerful ideologies of racial and cultural superiority.
The civilizing mission.
Yes, this often self-serving idea that Europeans had a duty to bring Christianity, commerce, and their form of civilization to supposedly backward peoples. It provided a justification, however flawed, for conquest and domination.
Who were the major players and where did they focus?
The British Empire was the largest, solidifying control over India, the jewel in the crown from 1858, as well as vast territories in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. France carved out a huge empire in Indochina, North and West Africa. The Netherlands held on to Indonesia. Belgium brutally controlled the Congo. Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain all had colonies. And by the late 19th, early 20th century, the U.S. acquired territories like the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and Japan began building its own empire in East Asia.
What was the actual impact on the people living in these colonized regions?
It was profound and often devastating. Imperial powers ruthlessly exploited natural resources and the local labor. They restructured economies to serve the needs of the colonizer, often focusing on cash crops or resource extraction, which disrupted traditional agriculture and made colonies dependent.
And the political impact?
They imposed new political borders, as we mentioned, often dividing ethnic groups or lumping rivals together, creating legacies of conflict. While some infrastructure like railways or ports might have been built, and some access to Western education provided for a small elite, the overwhelming experience for most was economic exploitation, cultural suppression, racism, and the loss of political autonomy and dignity.
Were there extreme cases?
Absolutely. King Leopold II's personal rule over the Congo Free State was notorious for its brutality, using forced labor to extract rubber, leading to the deaths of millions. It was horrific exploitation masked as a civilizing venture.
So this imperial order created deep global inequalities and resentments.
It absolutely did. It dramatically altered world demographics, economies, and power structures. But crucially, it also sowed the seeds of its own destruction. The experience of colonial rule itself fueled powerful anti-colonial nationalist movements that would eventually rise up and dismantle these empires in the 20th century. A double-edged legacy indeed.
Okay, so we have industrial capitalism creating wealth, but also inequality. And we have nationalism and imperialism reshaping the globe. It makes sense that ideologies would arise to critique this new world order.
Absolutely. And that's where socialism and communism come into the picture.
Challenging capitalism directly.
Exactly. Socialism emerged in the early 19th century as a broad critique of the inequalities and exploitation inherent in industrial capitalism. It encompassed a wide range of ideas, but generally advocated for more social or worker ownership and control of the means of production, the factories, the land, the resources, and a more egalitarian distribution of wealth.
And communism, how did that fit in?
Communism emerged as a more radical strand within the broader socialist movement. Its most influential formulation came from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
The Communist Manifesto.
Published in 1848, yes, a hugely influential text.
What was their single boldest idea, the core argument that really shook things up?
The core argument was that all of human history is fundamentally a story of class struggle.
Between who?
Between the oppressed and the oppressor. In the industrial era, this meant the struggle between the proletariat, the urban working class who owned only their labor, and the bourgeoisie, the capitalists who owned the means of production.
And their prediction?
They predicted this struggle would inevitably lead to a revolution, where the proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie.
Leading to?
Their ultimate goal was a communist society, classless, stateless, where the means of production were owned communally and exploitation and alienation would supposedly end. It culminated in that famous, powerful call to action. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
And these ideas, they spread.
They spread rapidly among intellectuals and, crucially, among the growing, often desperate, urban working classes in industrializing countries. They offered an explanation for their hardship and a vision of a radically different future.
And these weren't just abstract theories, were they? Communism was actually put into practice in the 20th century.
On a massive scale. The pivotal event was the Russian Revolution of 1917. Led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, they overthrew the Tsar and established the world's first explicitly socialist state, which soon became the Soviet Union, USSR.
And elsewhere.
Communism also became a powerful force influencing anti-colonial movements, offering an alternative to Western capitalism and imperialism. Communist parties took power in China in 1949 under Mao Zedong after a long civil war, across Eastern Europe after World War II under Soviet influence, in Cuba in 1959 under Fidel Castro, in Vietnam, and elsewhere.
So even in countries that didn't have communist revolutions, how did these socialist and communist critiques impact the trajectory of liberal democracies? Did they force changes?
Absolutely. Throughout the 20th century, the ideological clash between capitalism and communism defined global politics, especially during the Cold War. But even outside that direct conflict, the power of socialist ideas and the fear of revolution pressured capitalist states into making significant reforms.
Like what?
Things like the establishment of public education systems, the creation of social safety nets, unemployment insurance, pensions, healthcare, the expansion of voting rights, regulations on working conditions. Many of these were, in part, responses to socialist critiques and designed to ameliorate the harshest aspects of capitalism and, frankly, reduce the appeal of revolution.
So this ideological battle really shaped the entire 20th century, politically, economically, socially.
Fundamentally. And the debates sparked by Marx and others about inequality, ownership, and the role of the state continue to resonate and influence political discourse right around the world today.
The first half of the 20th century, it's just dominated by these two absolutely devastating world wars, conflicts on a scale never seen before, transforming global history and human consciousness.
Unprecedented in their scale and brutality, yes. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, was this horrific collision of industrialized nations. Fueled by nationalism, imperialism, and complex alliances, it resulted in a gruesome stalemate, particularly on the Western Front, with trench warfare and staggering casualties.
How many died?
Estimates are around 17 million people, soldiers, and civilians. It shattered the optimistic belief in progress that had marked the late 19th century.
And the political consequences?
Enormous. It led directly to the collapse of four major empires. The German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian empires all crumbled by the war's end.
Wow.
Old monarchies were swept away, replaced by new nation-states, often based on those nationalist principles, or by new republics. And ideologies like democracy, but also communism, surged. Remember, the Russian Bolshevik Revolution happened during WWI in 1917.
And then, tragically, just 2 decades later, the world plunged into an even more catastrophic conflict, World War II.
World War II, from 1939 to 1945, remains the deadliest conflict in human history. Estimates range from 70 to 85 million deaths.
Staggering.
And over half of those were civilians. It was driven, in large part, by aggressive, expansionist, totalitarian ideologies that rose up in the turbulent interwar years. Fascism, yes. In the wake of World War I, amidst economic depression and social unrest, extremist regimes promised national revival through authoritarianism. Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini were dictatorships that glorified aggressive nationalism, militarism, and, in the case of the Nazis, a virulent racial hierarchy.
And Hitler's expansionism triggered the war.
Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 ignited the war in Europe. These regimes, particularly Nazi Germany, perpetrated horrific atrocities on an industrial scale, most infamously the Holocaust.
And the systematic genocide.
The systematic, state-sponsored genocide of approximately 6 million European Jews, alongside millions of other victims targeted for their ethnicity, politics, sexuality, or disability. An unimaginable horror.
And World War II introduced new levels of destruction, didn't it? Including nuclear weapons.
Indeed. The war was truly global, with intense fighting across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. It saw strategic bombing of cities, massive civilian displacement, and it culminated, technologically and terrifyingly, with the first use of nuclear weapons.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
When the United States dropped atomic bombs on those Japanese cities in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender and ushering in the nuclear age. The war ended with the total defeat of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan by the Allies, led by Britain, the U.S., and the Soviet Union.
And the world order was completely reshaped again.
Completely. Europe was left devastated, physically and economically. The old colonial empires of Britain and France were fatally weakened, and the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant global superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War.
Did the sheer horror of these wars lead to attempts to prevent future conflicts?
There was an intense resolve, particularly after WWII, to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. Never again became a powerful slogan.
Leading to?
Leading to efforts like the founding of the United Nations, UN, in 1945, intended to provide a forum for international cooperation and peacekeeping. The war also spurred the modern human rights movement, culminating in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, establishing fundamental rights for all people.
So the legacy is profound.
Immense technological advances born from the wars, like radar, jet engines, rockets, the drive for international law and human rights, but also a permanent cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme nationalism, unchecked authoritarianism, and the destructive potential of modern warfare. It shaped the world we inherited in countless ways.
Okay, so World War II leaves the old European imperial powers battered and weakened. What happens next on the global stage?
What happens next is this seismic wave of change, particularly across Asia and Africa. It's the era of decolonization.
The empire's breaking apart.
Exactly. Those great European colonial empires, already strained by the war and facing growing resistance, effectively broke apart in a relatively rapid wave of decolonization, mostly in the decades following WWII.
What enabled this?
Several factors converged. The war had drained the resources and, importantly, the prestige and legitimacy of the imperial powers. Ideas about self-determination, fueled by both nationalism and the Allied rhetoric during the war, gained momentum. And crucially, indigenous independence movements, often led by Western-educated elites who turned the colonizers' own ideals against them, had been growing in strength, organization, and popular support for decades.
Can you give us some key examples of this massive shift? Where did it start?
A monumental starting point was the independence of India and Pakistan from British rule in 1947. Partition was bloody, but it signaled the beginning of the end for the British Empire.
And then it spread.
Yes, dozens and dozens of new nations emerged across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Caribbean between the late 1940s and the 1970s. For instance, the Dutch were forced to concede independence to Indonesia in 1949 after a bitter 4-year struggle.
Was it often violent?
It varied. Sometimes it was relatively peaceful, achieved through negotiation, like Ghana's independence from Britain in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African country to gain freedom.
A landmark moment.
A huge landmark. But other times it was incredibly violent. France fought long and brutal wars to try and hold on to Indochina, eventually losing in Vietnam and Algeria, where independence only came in 1962 after years of savage conflict. Britain faced violent uprisings like the Mau Mau in Kenya.
So by the mid-1960s?
By the mid-60s, most of Africa had decolonized. Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, the Congo, Senegal, one after another, new flags were raised. Nationalist leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru in India, Sukarno in Indonesia, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. They became the founding fathers, often revered figures of their new nations.
But gaining political independence didn't solve all the problems, did it? These new nations faced huge challenges.
Immense challenges. Those arbitrary colonial borders often lumped together diverse ethnic or religious groups with histories of rivalry, leading to internal tensions and sometimes civil war.
Economic challenges, too.
Absolutely. Many new nations remained economically dependent on their former colonial rulers, trapped in cycles of exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods, building stable political institutions, developing infrastructure, educating populations. It was a massive undertaking, often hampered by lack of resources and Cold War interference.
You mentioned the partition of India.
Yes, the partition of British India into India and Pakistan led to horrific communal violence and mass displacement. Civil wars ravaged places like the Congo shortly after independence, or Angola and Mozambique after Portugal finally withdrew in 1975. It wasn't always a smooth transition.
Yet, despite the challenges.
Despite the very real difficulties, decolonization represents the fundamental triumph of the idea of national self-determination. It was the global rejection of empire, the assertion of the principle that peoples have the right to govern themselves.
And it transformed the world map.
Completely. It dramatically increased the number of sovereign states in the world. Look at the UN membership. From 51 founding members in 1945 to around 150 by 1970. and it gave rise to the concept of the Third World, or the Global South, as a significant new bloc in international affairs, challenging the old power structures. It's why the world looks the way it does today.
So after the devastation of World War II, you'd hope for peace. But instead, the world almost immediately entered a new, deeply unsettling kind of global conflict. Not a hot war between the major powers, but a Cold War.
That's right. The Cold War really dominated geopolitics for over 4 decades, roughly from 1947 right up to 1991.
And it was a contest between...
The global contest between the two superpowers that emerged from WWII, each with fundamentally opposing ideologies. The United States, leading the capitalist, democratic Western Bloc, and the Soviet Union, USSR, leading the communist Eastern Bloc.
Why cold?
It was turned cold because the U.S. and the USSR, the two main protagonists, never actually fought each other directly in a full-scale declared war, largely because of the terrifying reality of nuclear weapons. Both sides developed vast nuclear arsenals by the 1950s. This created a situation known as mad mutually assured destruction. The fear was that any direct conflict could escalate into nuclear war, potentially destroying both sides and maybe the world, a terrifying deterrent.
So if direct war was mostly avoided, how did this intense rivalry play out across the globe for 40 years?
It played out in almost every other way imaginable. Through proxy wars. Meaning conflicts in other countries where each superpower backed opposing sides. The Korean War in the early 50s, the long and devastating Vietnam War from the 50s to the 70s, conflicts in Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua. These became battlegrounds for the larger ideological struggle. Pervasive espionage, think CIA versus KGB, political maneuvering, backing coups, funding friendly regimes or rebel groups, propaganda battles, an intense arms race constantly developing more powerful conventional and nuclear weapons, and even competition in culture and science.
Space race.
Exactly. Putting Sputnik, the first satellite, into orbit was a huge propaganda win for the Soviets. The U.S. responded by vowing to put a man on the moon, which they did. It was all part of the competition.
And the world became divided.
Largely divided into two camps, two spheres of influence. You had the U.S.-led NATO alliance in Western Europe and North America, plus allies like Japan and South Korea, versus the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. Many other countries tried to remain non-aligned, but the pressure to choose sides was immense.
And Berlin.
Yeah.
It became a real focal point, a symbol of this division.
A powerful and tragic symbol. Berlin itself was divided between East and West. In 1961, the communist East German regime, backed by Moscow, built the Berlin Wall.
Why?
To literally stop its own citizens from fleeing to the West. It became this stark physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it, separating Eastern and Western Europe, a concrete symbol of oppression for many.
Were there moments it nearly became a hot war?
Oh, yes. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is the most famous example. The discovery of Soviet nuclear missile sites in Cuba brought the world terrifyingly close to nuclear war. It was a moment of absolute brinkmanship. There were other dangerous flashpoints too, but also periods of détente, or easing of tensions, particularly in the 1970s.
So how did this era, defined by such intense ideological opposition, constant tension, and the shadow of nuclear war, finally come to a surprisingly peaceful end?
It effectively unraveled in the late 1980s. Several factors came together: internal problems within the Soviet Union, economic stagnation, the cost of the arms race. Then, crucial reforms initiated by the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev.
Glasnost and perestroika.
Glasnost, meaning openness, allowed for more political discussion. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to reform the stagnant economy. These reforms, perhaps unintentionally, unleashed forces that couldn't be easily controlled. At the same time, you had a wave of popular uprisings demanding change across Eastern Europe in 1989.
And the Berlin Wall.
The Berlin Wall was breached in November 1989. A hugely symbolic moment watched live around the world. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed, mostly peacefully. Germany reunified in 1990. And then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself formally dissolved. The Cold War was over.
And the outcome?
It was largely unforeseen in its speed and peacefulness. It marked the apparent triumph, at least for a time, of liberal capitalist democracy as the dominant global model.
But the legacy of the Cold War lingers.
Immensely. It left behind military alliances like NATO, which still exists and has expanded. Vast nuclear arsenals remain. Many regional conflicts today have roots in Cold War superpower meddling. But its end also undeniably opened the way for a new era of increased global interaction, what we call globalization.
And that brings us, finally, right up to the era we're living in now. A world defined by accelerating interconnection, interdependence, unlike anything seen before in history.
Globalization and the digital age, yes.
So what is globalization, really?
Broadly, since the late 20th century, and especially accelerating after the Cold War ended, the world has experienced this process of increasing interconnection. It's about interdependence among countries economically, culturally, politically, technologically.
What drove it initially?
With the Cold War over, many ideological barriers fell. Many countries reduced trade barriers, embraced more market-oriented economies. The 1990s saw this huge surge in global trade and investment.
Corporations going global.
Exactly. Corporations became truly multinational, setting up factories and offices worldwide. Manufacturing supply chains stretched across continents. Your phone might be designed in California, use components from South Korea and Taiwan, and be assembled in China.
And institutions supported this.
International institutions like the World Trade Organization, WTO, founded in 1995, aimed to regulate and promote free trade. Regional trade agreements like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994 further reduced barriers. It created a framework for a more integrated global economy.
But it wasn't just economics, right? What were the key technological drivers that really shrunk the world?
Technology was absolutely crucial. Advances in transportation, like the development of affordable jet travel and massive container ships, drastically lowered the cost of moving goods and people across the globe,
Making global trade feasible.
on an unprecedented scale. But even more profoundly, you have the revolution in information and communication technologies, ICT.
The internet.
The internet, yes. It spread from the 1990s onwards, followed by mobile phones becoming ubiquitous, connected billions of people virtually, almost instantly, and at very low cost.
So what did that enable?
By the 2000s, someone in Brazil could easily video chat with family in Japan. A company in Germany could outsource software development or customer service to India. Music, films, news, ideas from one country could spread worldwide almost instantaneously. Culture became much more fluid and globalized.
So a greater exchange of culture, but also it seems like our problems have become globalized too.
That's a critical point. Culturally, yes, globalization has led to this greater exchange. You see the worldwide popularity of things like jeans, sushi, K-pop, Hollywood movies. A kind of global culture emerges alongside local ones. But politically, our biggest challenges are now undeniably global in scope.
Such as?
Problems like climate change, which doesn't respect national borders. Pandemics, as we saw so clearly with COVID-19, can spread rapidly around an interconnected world. International terrorism, financial crises, they all transcend national boundaries and really demand international cooperation, however difficult that proves to be.
And with all the benefits of economic growth, have there been downsides or new challenges created by globalization?
Absolutely. While globalization has spurred significant economic growth overall, lifting hundreds of millions out of extreme poverty, especially in Asia, and creating a large global middle class, it's also brought serious challenges.
Like inequality.
Yes. Economic inequality within many countries, including wealthy ones, has often widened. As manufacturing jobs move to countries with cheaper labor, workers in some sectors in richer countries face job losses or wage stagnation, leading to significant social and political discontent.
And cultural impacts.
Some communities feel their local cultures and identities are threatened by the flood of global media and consumer bids, a sense of cultural homogenization, or resistance to it.
And the digital age aspect.
The digital age is completely intertwined with recent globalization. The rise of personal computers from the 80s, the internet from the 90s, smartphones, social media, and now the explosion of artificial intelligence. It's fundamentally changed how people work, communicate, get information, form communities. It's created this information society with unprecedented reach and speed, but also new challenges around misinformation, privacy, and the digital divide.
So to wrap up this era, the big idea is really this intensely interconnected human world.
I think that's fair. Globalization, powered by technology, has knitted humanity closer together economically, culturally, politically than ever before in history. Understanding this deep interconnection is absolutely key to making sense of almost any major current event, from supply chain disruptions affecting your local store to international climate negotiations. The opportunities and the crises of the 21st century are truly undeniably global in nature. We're all in it together, like it or not.
Wow. What an incredible, almost dizzying journey we've taken through these big ideas in history.
It's a lot to cover.
From the very first farmers deciding to settle down right up to our hyper-connected digital world, it's clear how each step, each big idea, really built upon the last fundamentally reshaping human civilization along the way.
It's true. And hopefully we've seen her deeply these historical shifts, these big ideas, influence your life today. Right now.
In what ways?
Well, from the food you eat, a product of that Neolithic revolution, and the way you communicate instantly across distances, thank the digital age to the systems of government that structure your society, drawing on enlightened ideals, and even the global challenges like climate change that we all face together.
Yeah.
The power of understanding the why behind our present, tracing those threads back, it's truly profound. It helps reveal the hidden currents shaping our world.
Our hope with this deep dive was not just to, lay out the facts, but maybe to spark even more curiosity about the world around you.
Exactly.
We really invite you to notice how these big ideas, agriculture, writing, democracy, science, nationalism, globalization, how they continue to play out. You see them in the daily news, in your local communities, maybe even in your own personal experiences and choices.
Think about how even a small choice you make today, what you buy, how you vote, how you connect with others, might be an echo, however faint, of these monumental historical shifts.
Something to ponder. Until next time, keep digging deeper.